But in any case, somebody had put the idea there. In 1966, the Moline City Council approved the agreement to buy the island for $75,000. Now, if you put, I just said it was worth $33,000 in '56, then they paid $75,000. I don't know, is there another scam here that somebody wants to investigate? How did the city get taken for this extra increase? But that's not, I don't know anything about that. I'm innocent. In 1968, Moline signed a contract to tear down the buildings and remove the railroad ties. There were only a couple of buildings that were still left by that point. But that operation was halted because of worry about an underground cable from the power plant to the arsenal. So the bridge that we now can walk across, 72, there have been some modifications of that, but that's one of the oldest bridges in the upper Mississippi, what was called the original wagon bridge going across. That's been strengthened with steel and some of the other, but the original one. Anyway, that was closed to prevent any vandalism and thefts of equipment on the site. In February 1969, the bridge closure extended indefinitely, and we're still indefinitely, okay, at this point. And that's a good news. That was good news. That's about the time when I was first introduced to the island by the then chaplain at Augustana College, Reverend Richard Swanson, who lived not very far from that, and he used to take his kids over to play there, and he'd walk his dogs. And so he knew he knew me, and I knew him a little bit. He says, oh, shortly after I joined the faculty in '68, he says, Norm, you got to come and see this place. It's less than a mile from the college. And so we went over there, and it sort of got in my blood also. In the early 1970s, the Davenport Army Engineer Battalion finished the demolition of the remaining structures. I was here enough to remember, and some of you were here longer, I think, but there was one big structure that even had like concrete kind of roofing, one big substantial structure. And one of those slabs at some point came down, some support was down. And I think then everybody realized this is dangerous. We got to get that building out of there, just in case somebody could have been walking by, one of those slabs came. In any case, this Army engineer group stepped in and did the good job of at least making it safe. 1971, a report prepared by me at Augustana College called Sylvan Island, A Century of Choice. We decided we got some students involved in the island. Here's the thickness of it. We got some students involved in turning this into a lab. And so we looked at soils, and we looked at vegetation, and we looked at historical stuff and all of that, so that we reviewed the natural characteristics, we documented the history as best as we could of the island's uses, and recommended that it become a combination nature, fishing, and historic park. We didn't know that we were really going to come up with recommendations, but the students and I thought, gee, we ought to put that idea out. That's what seemed pretty logical to us. And that was the last part of this, filled with these whereas and whereas and whereas. Therefore, be it resolved that the island be designated this combination nature park, which at that point was fully wooded on the west end. As you look at your map on the left side, that's been wooded a long time, because even the workers remember when the steel mill was on the eastern part, the more triangular shape of the island, the workers would go over there during lunch hour. And they'd get out of the heat and dirt of the factory, go across what is now the trail, and they'd eat the lunch, and there was a little place where they could play some games. But most of that vegetation on the west side has been there a long time. On the east side, it would have been just the factory. It's coincidentally, this was our own idea, and I shared it with some people. There was a fellow, maybe some of you knew him, Larry Fossbinder, who was on the Moline Citizens Advisory Committee. And then there was another gentleman, I'm sure, I can't remember his name. He was a big, tall fellow, pretty powerful in Moline politics. And Larry, I think, was on the Democratic side of the coin. This other fellow was more on the Republican side. But on this, they both agreed. They were both on the Moline Citizens Advisory Committee. They endorsed our plan, but it stalled in the City Council. And one of those city council meetings, a person told me, they said, "Thank you, Professor, for this idea. But remember, you live in Rock Island, and this is Moline. We'll make our own decisions." So, okay, thank you. That's all right. Anyway, what the key points, though, that we made to the group in the report: the condition of the site itself, industrial ruins, but also, as the geographers in the room know, the spatial context or situation of the site. There were some people who recommended this would be a good neighborhood park. But we said no, it wouldn't, because the neighborhood park, you would have to weave your way through industrial buildings. At that point, 2 or 3 tracks on the rail lines, a little open space, so you were a good 2 blocks from where little kids would be playing. So we said, no, you don't want to make that a place that's just inviting to have little 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds saying, oh, let's go across the tracks and walk through this maze. We said that's not a place that would really work. So that's why we're saying context of the site was like that. An emerging interest in historic preservation at that point. This is where I came up with the idea, because I was part of some of the stuff I studied was preservation. There was a growing interest in historic preservation of everyday workplaces. Not just the Mount Vernons and Monticellos of the world, but places where people work, and an emerging field called industrial archaeology. So rather than just thinking of archaeology, which you see down at Cahokia or Indian ruins, or the Incas and so on, industrial archaeology, where manufacturing processes no longer are taking place. This was the basis of our study. Without knowing that, what was happening, Pastor Swanson, he knew a fellow in Chicago from his previous congregation named Don Moore, who was a friend of Buckminster Fuller, kind of a big fellow 30 years ago of creative thinking about our planet. And so Don Moore said, I want to hear about this. He was putting together a report called Landscape Pollutants as Resources. Now we would say how you can turn recycled plastics and things like that into a new product. Take the waste of one process and turn it into a good thing. Take a pollutant as a resource. Don Moore was curious about this, and Swanee said, you got to come down. And so Don said he wanted to talk with us and some others. So on some little secondary path at Sylvan Island, we had a catered catfish dinner on the island. And here we're sitting there and we're thinking, man, these are only industrial ruins. And now we're having this nice catfish dinner brought in by some, and we're chatting about environmental things. He liked the idea a lot because while he had been thinking of things like heat and bottles and things like that, here he said, you folks are turning 38 acres as a pollutant, a damaged landscape, and now you're talking about using that in a positive way, as a park. So he said, rather than thinking of pollutants as resources just of little things, let's think of whole landscapes like that. And he ended up including that in a presentation he made at the Western Hemisphere Conference on World Health in Rio. Now I'm thinking, really, this is just Sylvan Island. I mean, I'm not sure this deserves to be at the Western Hemisphere Conference on World Health. But that's where it came, the idea makes a lot of sense, and I hope you pick up on that, because that's caught on more and more now. We now call it things like adaptive reuse of buildings. An old building, rather than dumping it right away, let's put it into good use. So from 1970s to the present, decades of regular cleanups by Augustana students and members of the Black Hawk chapter of the Isaac Walton League. We would go out there in the initial years with big dump trucks and load them up. It's one weekend, the biggest of all, we had 7 big dump trucks full of stuff. Stoves, refrigerators, sofas, you name it, because people had been able to go across that bridge dumping things, and millions of tin or metal cans before we had aluminum cans. There were some, now no exaggeration folks, there were some places you had an area half the size of this room at least where you would be hard pressed to find a square inch of dirt rather than rusty beer cans out at the place. And so we carted this stuff off. Meanwhile, Moline, they're planning their park committee on the city council. 2 people liked our idea. 2 people thought a park is where you have nice manicured lawns and maybe a 9-hole golf course or something like that over there. 2 to 2, no action. 2 to 2, a different proposal, no action. Meanwhile, the vegetation's coming back, and it didn't bother us. If they can't make up their mind, good things tended to come out of that delay. But still the delay was getting to some people. It bothered me, but I didn't have the emotion that the people who had worked in the factory, Jesse Perez and his brother Harry Perez and Ben Taranas and some of the people in the Floreciente neighborhood, they said this has taken too long. They were worried that that'd never get done, and then the Quad Cities would forget the sweat and blood people of that community had put in making steel. They said that mill was too important to the life of the Quad Cities to let it be forgotten. And one after another of these former workers at the mill were dying off. We got to form a group, so they formed what was called the Sylvan Island Dreamers. Most of the members were former workers on Sylvan Island, many of Hispanic American background during its industrial years. Also, the people from the Isaac Walton League were involved with Dreamers, and then they asked me, graciously on their part, they asked me to be a part of this, all of whom wanted to make sure that the legacy would not be lost by proceeding with the basic goal of the 1971 Moline Augustana study. Members donated countless volunteers on the island and raised money for different projects, construction of fishing piers, preparations of trails, etc. 1994, Planning Resources, a group. I take my urban planning class there every other year. This is in Wheaton. A kind of a really quality operation. And one of their fellows had some roots to the Quad Cities, and I told them about what was happening down here, and they were fascinated by it. And they said, we'll be happy to help out. And of course, we didn't have any money. Basically, they said, just if you pay our gas coming down, we'll spend a day with you, and we'll put together a nice little report. $350 it cost us to get these professional planners to come down and work with us. And that put a more official cast on our dreams ideas. And I think that was right. You know, it's one thing for Jesse Perez or Norm Moline to go before Moline City Council. Well, okay, these folks have their ideas. But here, Planning Resources, Inc. Comes up and says, gee, it's very good. It's almost, intentionally, they wanted to put in print what we had suggested, and it moved forward a little bit. And then an unfortunate event, which turned out to have a positive, in 1994, the death of Thomas Rogers. And some of you in the room, I think, know Tom Rogers. I never had the privilege of knowing him, but he died, and led by Tom Getz, they were trying to figure out what's a way that we can honor this quadriplegic, Tom Rogers. They didn't know about Sylvan Island. Tom Rogers liked the outdoors. But he didn't know about Sylvan Island. The Dreamers, we had an idea with no money. The people who were honoring Tom Rogers had money, but no idea. And so somebody said, let's get you folks together down at the captain's table for lunch. And I wish more things would happen this way. We went in and greeted him. Some of us didn't know each other at all. We met and we talked. And by the time we left at 1:30 or 1:45, the hands had been shaken. We're going ahead with building the visitor center and dedicating it to Tom Rogers. I remember Tom Getz said in that conversation, how much do you think it would take to build that center? Well, Rock Island architect Ed Anger, he'd prepared the design, and he had thought it probably would cost about $50,000. So I told Tom Getz, I said, oh, I'm sorry, it's probably going to cost at least $50,000. Tom says, oh, that's no problem. He says, knowing how people like Tom Rogers will be able to raise that money in 3 or 4 weeks. And he was absolutely right. These were people of income levels, I guess, that many of us on the Dreamers weren't used to, that come up with that money that quickly. Anyway, we went ahead with it, and the Ed Anger design went forward. We got Midwest Exhibits, which is still in existence in Davenport, a terrific signage group, doing some signage, I think, for Blackhawk State Historic Site. They assisted with the preparation of that little visitor center. We didn't want it to be big, but we wanted to have a few maps. As you go, most of you know this, when you get on the island, you